the most feared Mafia King in all of Seoul, a man whose name made grown men lower their eyes and clear the room. He controlled empires. He commanded silence. He never begged. He never broke. He never knelt for anyone. Until today. He is outside a penthouse door right now, on his knees, on cold concrete, bleeding, crying. His expensive clothes mean nothing. His power means nothing. His empire means nothing. The men who once followed him everywhere, gone. He came alone. No cars, no guards, no gifts. Just a broken man on his knees, outside the door of the woman he abandoned 3 years ago. The woman he accused. The woman he vanished on without a goodbye. The woman who carried his twins alone, delivered them alone, and raised them alone for 3 years without a single word from him. If you're listening right now, help me prove my mother wrong. She said this channel would never reach 3,000 subscribers. But I believe stories like this, stories about regret, redemption, and the consequences of our choices, deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our powerful stories. Give this video a like if you're already hooked by what you just heard. Drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Africa, Canada, Australia. We love connecting with our global family. And please share this video with friends and family who believe in second chances and facing the truth. Your support helps us create more incredible content that touches hearts. Now, let's continue this emotional journey. The name Ryan Seo-jin was not spoken carelessly anywhere in Seoul. Not in the glass towers of Gangnam, where legitimate money moved in daylight. Not in the underground rooms where real power was negotiated after midnight. Not in the port districts where his shipments moved through official records like they simply did not exist. He was the most feared man in this city. Not because of what people openly saw, but because of what they understood without ever being told. His empire existed entirely in darkness. Territories that answered to no government and no authority but him. Men who challenged that empire had a way of disappearing without explanation and without trace. So when Ryan walked into Hannah Bank's private wealth division that Tuesday morning, every single person on that floor felt the shift before they even looked up. Voices dropped mid-sentence. Staff straightened without knowing why. A junior employee knocked something off his desk and did not bend to pick it up. Security stepped aside without instruction. Ryan moved through all of it in a dark tailored suit, slow, deliberate steps. Intricate Korean tattoos crawling up his neck and across both hands, eyes absorbing everything and returning absolutely nothing. He stopped at the third desk. The woman behind it had one finger raised in his direction without looking up. One moment. He had never waited for anyone in his life. He stood there and waited. When she finally finished her call, she looked up and smiled professionally. "Mr. Ryan, I'm Lydia Morgan. I'll be your relationship manager. How can I help you today?" He sat across from her. She opened her notepad without hesitation, asked him questions like he was any other client sitting in any other chair. He answered them. He filled out the form she placed in front of him. He left when the appointment ended. He came back the next morning with a portfolio clarification that needed no clarifying whatsoever. Lydia opened the file, studied the numbers for exactly 5 seconds, then looked directly at him. "Everything here is exactly as it was yesterday, Mr. Ryan." He said nothing. She waited. He came back 2 days later, then again 3 days after that, for visits in 2 weeks, each time arriving with a different reason that was not really a reason at all. On the 4th visit, she looked up from her screen before he even reached her desk. "Mr. Ryan, we both know you don't need another appointment." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Almost. "Then perhaps I should ask you to dinner instead." She studied him for a quiet moment. "Perhaps you should," she said. He chose a quiet restaurant in Itaewon. Private, no crowds, the kind of place where nobody looked twice and nobody asked questions. Lydia arrived in a dark green dress, unhurried, completely composed. She looked around the room once, found him at the corner table, and walked over like she dined with dangerous men every Thursday evening of her life. He stood when she arrived. She noticed. They sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she opened the menu and said calmly, You strike me as someone who always orders the same thing. He looked at her. And you strike me as someone who reads people. It's my job, she said. I'm a banker. He held her gaze. You were reading me before you knew my account balance. She looked up from the menu with a slight smile. Most people sit differently when they're used to being feared. He was quiet for a moment. And how do you sit? Like myself, she said simply. That dinner lasted 3 hours. He barely touched his food. She ate everything on her plate. He drove her home and sat in his car for a long time after her door closed, staring at nothing and thinking about everything. He called 3 days later. She answered on the second ring. I thought you might not call, she said. I'm a man of my word, he said quietly. Is that true about everything? He paused for a moment. Call me back in a year. She laughed. That sound stayed with him for the rest of the day. They had dinner again the following week. Then a walk along the Han River on a Sunday afternoon. His idea, which surprised him as much as it surprised her. She wore flat shoes and didn't check her phone once. They talked for 2 hours without running out of things to say. She asked him about his childhood the way nobody ever asked, not fishing for information, simply curious about who he actually was underneath everything else. He found himself answering honestly, more honestly than he had spoken to anyone in years. Over the weeks that followed, something quiet built steadily between them. Not fast, not dramatic, just real. He began leaving operations earlier. She began leaving a light on. Neither of them mentioned it. They didn't need to. Some things build themselves when two people simply keep showing up. 3 months, and he told her he wanted to meet her mother. Lydia stopped walking and looked at him. You want to meet my mother? Yes. She studied his face. Why? He held her gaze steady. Because she matters to you. Diana Morgan, Lydia's mother, the woman who had raised her only daughter alone after relocating from America to Seoul years earlier, building a quiet, dignified life between two worlds, opened the door that Sunday evening and looked at Ryan a way only a mother can look at the man now standing in front of her only child. Measuring, unhurried, she shook his hand once and said simply, Come in. Dinner started quietly. Diana asked careful questions dressed as conversation. Ryan answered each one without offering more than was asked. At one point, Diana went to the kitchen, and Lydia followed. Well, Lydia whispered. Diana was quiet for a moment. He looks at you like you're the only person in the room. Lydia said nothing. Diana turned to face her daughter. But he is carrying something very heavy. I can see it. Lydia looked toward the door. I know, Mama. Diana looked at her carefully. Do you love him? Lydia didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. He proposed on a Thursday evening. No restaurant. No audience. He called her at the bank that afternoon and said simply, Come home early tonight. She heard something different underneath his voice and left at 4 without telling anyone why. When she walked into the penthouse, the lights were low and there was food on the table. He had cooked it himself. She could tell immediately from the slightly burnt edges and the uneven presentation. She set her bag down slowly and looked at the table, then at him. You cooked. I tried, he said quietly. She sat down and tasted it carefully. Ryan, this is terrible. He sat across from her. I know. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen from him before, completely unguarded, something close to afraid. He reached slowly into his jacket and set a small black ring box on the table between them. I don't have many words for this kind of thing, he said. So I'll say this. I want you in my life. Permanently. She looked at the box, then at him. Her eyes filled slowly. She opened it. A long, quiet moment passed between them. Then she looked up. Yes, she said softly. They married on a quiet Thursday afternoon at a courthouse in central Seoul. No ceremony. No guest beyond what paperwork required. Just the two of them and Diana Morgan sitting in the front row wearing a pale blue dress, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes full of something she was working hard to hold. After the signing, Diana stood and pulled Lydia into a long, wordless hug. Then she stepped back and turned to Ryan. She looked at him directly. Take care of her. Not a request. He held her gaze. I will. Diana studied him a moment longer, then nodded once. Small, quiet. They moved into his penthouse together after that. Lydia kept her position at the bank. She had worked too long and too hard to walk away from it. Every morning she left pressed and professional, heels moving down the hallway with purpose. Ryan would stand at the kitchen counter with his coffee and watch her gather her things at the door. He never said much in those mornings. Neither did she. But every single morning before she left, she paused at the doorway and looked back at him once. He always looked back. Nobody told them to do that. It simply became theirs. A full year had passed since their wedding. A good year, a warm year, the kind of year that makes a person believe they have finally found the right life. But somewhere inside that year, small things began appearing that individually meant nothing and together meant everything. A phone call Ryan took in the bedroom with the door pulled firmly shut. Something he had never done before in their home. A man she didn't recognize sitting in their building lobby past 11 at night, nodding at Ryan as he passed like they had a standing arrangement she knew nothing about. A transfer notification on their joint account. A number with so many zeros. She set her phone face down on her desk at the bank and sat completely still for a full minute. That Thursday at dinner, she set her fork down carefully and looked at him. What exactly does your business involve, Ryan? He looked up. Import and logistics. That's what you tell people, she said quietly. I'm not people. I'm your wife. He held her gaze. You don't need to know everything. Her chest tightened. I'm not asking about everything. I'm asking about the things that are going to get you killed or taken away from me. He was quiet. He picked his fork back up. Something had just closed inside him that she didn't know how to open. Kwon Tae-hyun had been Ryan's right hand for 7 years. His most trusted lieutenant. The man who sat closest at every table and spoke last when everyone else had already spoken. Who handled the operations Ryan could never be seen near and never asked twice. Who understood the empire with a kind of depth that only came from total access and total trust. In 7 years, he had never once given Ryan a single reason to question him. What Ryan never saw was the cold, quiet calculation behind Tae-hyun's eyes every time Lydia called during a meeting. Every time Ryan left early because of her. Every time the man who once stayed in operations until 2 in the morning now came home for dinner without needing to be reminded. Tae-hyun watched the transformation over months and felt the danger of it growing. So he began slowly. One evening after a late meeting, she was asking your driver about your schedule again today, boss. Ryan glanced up. She's my wife. Of course, Tae-hyun said smoothly. I'm sure it's nothing. Weeks later, I saw her on her phone in the parking garage. I didn't recognize the number she was dialing. He never accused directly. He just planned it carefully, month after month, drip by drip, waiting patiently for the poison to take root. Several months into his quiet campaign, Tae-hyun came to Ryan's private office and placed a folder on the desk without a single word. No explanation, no preamble, just the folder sitting between them. Ryan looked at it for a moment, then opened it slowly. Inside, printed phone records, dates and time spanning 6 weeks. A name at the very top that Ryan recognized immediately and felt deep in his jaw. A federal investigator who'd been quietly circling his operations like a patient predator for over 2 years. Tae-hyun stood with his hands folded behind his back and spoke carefully. She has been in regular contact with this man, boss. Conversations averaging 15 to 20 minutes each. She knows your routes, your shipment timelines. Someone on the outside is building a case, and she is the one feeding it to them. Ryan stared at those pages without moving or speaking. This was Lydia, the woman who left his food warm on the stove when he came home late, without ever being asked, who had never once pushed for information he didn't offer first. But the documents looked completely real. The dates aligned perfectly. And Tae-hyun, who had not once in 7 years brought him anything false, stood there with completely steady eyes. Ryan closed the folder slowly. Leave it, he said quietly. Tae-hyun walked out, and Ryan sat alone as something cold and heavy began settling deep inside his chest. After that evening, Ryan came home differently. Not loud, not explosive, just gone from behind his eyes. He sat at dinner without really eating. He answered questions with single words. He stopped coming to the balcony in the evenings. Lydia watched him carefully for 4 days before she followed him to his study one night and stood in the doorway until he looked up. "Talk to me?" He turned back to his desk. "I'm fine." "You are not fine, Ryan, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend otherwise." She stepped inside. He stood slowly and placed the folder on the desk between them. "Explain this." She looked at the papers. Her face moved through confusion, then disbelief, then a cold fury she could barely hold inside her body. "Who gave you this?" He said nothing. "This is fabricated. Someone built this and handed it to you." His jaw was stone. "The records are clear. The records are lies." Her voice cracked at the edges. "Tell me who gave you this. Please, Ryan, look at me." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Then he said quietly, "If I ever find out you've been talking about my business to anyone outside, this is over." He didn't leave that night, but something between them had already broken beyond that room. For 3 days after that, their home was a place of careful silences and closed doors. Ryan had made a decision inside himself, quiet, cold, final. He had built his empire on one rule above everything else. Trust no one who could expose you. Not partners. Not enemies. Not even the people closest to you. Tae-hyun had served him for 7 years without a single lie. The documents were real. The dates aligned. And a man in his position could not afford to let sentiment override evidence. He told himself this every morning. He told himself Lydia was a liability he could no longer carry. He told himself cutting her off cleanly was the only logical decision. He told himself feelings were weakness, and weakness got people killed. Lydia tried once more, sitting across from him in the living room. "Whatever someone told you about me, it isn't true. I need you to believe me." He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, something that looked almost like pain. Then it closed. "Get some rest, Lydia." She walked to their bedroom alone. That night, she fell asleep believing tomorrow would be different. When she woke, the other side of the bed was cold. His phone disconnected. His men unreachable. His office cleared. He had vanished without a word, without a note, without a goodbye. He had chosen his empire, and he had chosen it completely. She called every number she had for him. None connected. She drove to his office building. The receptionist looked at her carefully and said Mr. Ryan no longer operated from that location. Lydia stood on the pavement outside for a long time after that door closed behind her. People moved around her on the street like water around a stone. She didn't feel any of it. She went home. 3 days later, she was standing in their bathroom. His shaving kit still on the shelf exactly where he always kept it. His towel still hanging on the hook, holding a pregnancy test in both hands. She already knew before she looked down. She sat on the cold edge of the bathtub and stared at the result without moving. Outside, Seoul went on. Traffic, voices. The entire city completely indifferent to the quiet catastrophe inside one woman's bathroom. She should call him. She had no number. Find him. She had no address. She sat there in the silence of a bathroom that still carried the faint familiar smell of him, with everything pressing inward from every wall. Then something deep inside her chest simply gave way. She set the test down carefully beside his shaving kit, put both hands slowly over her face, and wept in a way she had never allowed herself to before. She stayed in their penthouse after that. She couldn't fully explain why. Perhaps because leaving meant accepting there was nothing left to come back to. His coffee cup stayed on the counter, exactly where he left it. His jacket stayed on the chair by the door. She never moved them. She had stopped going to work, the pregnancy making everything heavier and her composure impossible to perform in front of clients who needed her to be steady. In the evening, she sat in the quiet living room with the lights low and talked softly to her stomach about small things, about the day, about what soul sounded like at night when everything went still. Once she reached for a pen and a notepad and wrote him a letter. 3 full pages of everything sitting inside her chest with nowhere else to go. When she finished, she read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it inside a drawer and never opened that drawer again. What she did not know what she had absolutely no way of knowing, was that somewhere across the city Ryan had quietly placed one of his most discreet men outside her building. He told himself it was security protocol. He told himself he felt nothing. He told himself he had made the right decision. Every single day he sat alone in a new penthouse across the city and lied to himself. Nearly 3 months passed like that. 3 months of waking up in a bed that was too big. 3 months of eating alone at a table set for two. 3 months of a growing stomach and a silence so heavy it had its own weight. One morning she woke up and simply knew she could not stay another day. She packed slowly and deliberately. Not everything, just what was hers before any of this began. She moved through each room one last time. The balcony where they used to sit without needing to speak. The kitchen counter where he stood every morning watching her leave. The doorway where she always looked back and he always looked back. She stood there for a long moment. Then she walked to the kitchen and placed her key on the counter beside his coffee cup. She took nothing that belonged to him. She rode the elevator down alone and stood in the lobby at the bottom. Then she took out her phone and called the only person who had never let her down in her entire life. It rang once. Mama. Her voice barely held itself together. Diana didn't ask a single question. Just said quietly, "I'll have your room ready, baby." That was all it took. Lydia broke down completely right there in that lobby before she even reached the door. She arrived at her mother's penthouse with one bag and a face that told the whole story before she could say a single word. Diana opened the door, looked at her daughter, then at her stomach, and pulled her inside without speaking. No questions. No told you so. No words at all. Just her arms wrapping around Lydia completely and holding on. Lydia broke in her mother's embrace the way she hadn't allowed herself to break in that penthouse alone. Deep, ugly, honest crying. The kind that comes from somewhere below grief and below anger and below everything a person holds together for too long alone. Diana held her and said nothing because she understood that some pain cannot be spoken over. It can only be held. When Lydia finally quieted Diana, guided her to the bedroom that had always been hers, and sat beside her on the edge of the bed. "You don't have to explain anything tonight," Diana said softly. Lydia stared at the ceiling. "I don't know how to explain it anyway." Diana reached over and covered her daughter's hand with hers. "You don't have to." Outside, Seoul hummed quietly through the window. Inside that bedroom, a mother sat beside her only child and simply refused to let go. The weeks at Diana's penthouse settled into a quiet rhythm. Lydia slept, ate, let her mother take care of her for the first time in years without arguing about it. 3 weeks and Diana drove her to a clinic for a proper prenatal scan. The doctor applied the gel, moved the instrument slowly, and then paused. "Ms. Morgan." Lydia looked at the ceiling. "There are 2 heartbeats." The room went completely still. Lydia turned her head toward the screen. 2. Diana, sitting in the chair beside the bed, pressed both hands over her mouth. Lydia reached sideways without looking and found her mother's hand and held it. She didn't speak for a long time. On the drive home, Diana glanced across at her. "How are you feeling?" Lydia stared through the windshield at Seoul passing by. "I don't know yet." Diana nodded. "That's okay." Back at the penthouse, Lydia sat in the living room for a long time with both hands resting on her stomach. 2 lives. She was carrying 2 lives entirely alone in the city, where the only person who should have been beside her had chosen to disappear. She closed her eyes, then straightened slowly, and decided right then that whatever came next, she would not fall apart again. Diana never told Lydia about the health concern. She had received the results 3 weeks before Lydia arrived on her doorstep, a condition that needed monitoring, medication, careful management. She looked at her daughter's face the evening Lydia arrived and made a quiet decision. Her daughter was already carrying enough. This could wait. So Diana moved to the penthouse every morning with her usual steady energy, cooking, laughing softly, folding baby clothes, while privately attending her appointments alone and telling no one. One night Lydia couldn't sleep. She came out of her room at 2 in the morning and found the second crib still unassembled in the living room. She sat on the floor and opened the instruction manual. 20 minutes later, she had pieces scattered in every direction and absolutely no idea what connected to what. Diana appeared in the doorway in her robe. She looked at the chaos on the floor, then sat down beside her daughter, without a word, and picked up a piece. They worked together in silence for the next hour. No instructions exchanged beyond what the manual required. Just a mother and her daughter on the floor in the middle of the night, building something for two children who weren't here yet. When the crib finally clicked into place, they both looked at it. Neither spoke, but something passed between them in that silence that words would have only made smaller. 6 months had passed since Lydia arrived at her mother's penthouse. 6 months of building a life inside a life, growing, preparing, surviving. 9 months total since Ryan had vanished without a word. Labor began on a Tuesday morning, earlier than the doctor had predicted, but not by much. Lydia woke at 5 with the first contractions already steady and close together. She called to Diana from the hallway. Calm, focus, the voice of a woman who had decided long ago that she would not fall apart at the moment that mattered most. Diana was dressed and at the door within minutes. They drove to the hospital together in the gray Seoul morning. No husband, no father, just two women who had held everything together for 9 months and were not about to stop now. The delivery was long and hard, hours of it, and then complications arrived without warning. Ashton came first, but his vitals dropped the moment he entered the world. Machines alarmed. Nurses moved with tight, focused faces. A doctor said words that made the air go cold. Diana stood in the hallway outside with both hands pressed flat together, lips moving quietly, eyes shut. Then a cry. Small, exhausted, fighting. Ashton's first sound in the world. Then Arya came, stronger, clearer, announcing herself without hesitation. Diana heard both cries from the hallway and slid slowly down the wall with her hand pressed over her heart. Inside, Lydia held both of them against her chest and wept without making a single sound. Lydia gripped the bed rail and held on. She called Ryan's name once, not because she wanted him there, but because terror reaches for familiar without asking permission. The first days at Diana's penthouse with Ashton and Arya were the most exhausting and most beautiful days of Lydia's life, existing completely at the same time. She learned to feed two babies simultaneously out of pure necessity. She learned that Arya would sleep through almost anything and that Ashton would wake at the smallest sound and lie there silently with his eyes wide open, dark, serious, absorbing the world with an intensity that made Lydia's chest tighten every single time she looked at him. He had his father's eyes, exactly his father's eyes, the same weight behind them, the same quiet that asked nothing and noticed everything. She would sit in the nursing chair at 3 a.m. holding him and look at his face and feel love and grief occupying exactly the same space inside her at exactly the same moment. Diana moved through the house at all hours without being asked, warming bottles, changing Arya, sitting beside Lydia during the long, quiet stretches of night, without needing to fill the silence with anything. One night Diana came in to find Lydia sitting in the dark with Ashton asleep on her chest, tears running silently down her face. Diana sat beside her. "You are doing an incredible thing," she said quietly. Lydia didn't answer. She just held her son tighter. 9 months after Ryan Seoul walked out his own life without a word, Kwon Tae-hyun walked into his office with news he had not anticipated delivering. He stood across from his boss with carefully neutral eyes and spoke evenly. "There is something you should know." Ryan looked up from the documents on his desk. She gave birth. Ryan went completely still. The room went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. Twins, Tae-hyun continued. A boy and a girl. Both delivered. Both alive. Ryan did not move for a long moment. Something shifted behind his eyes, slow and deep, like a fault line adjusting far below the surface. Tae-hyun had expected coldness. He had expected the boss to nod once and return to his documents. Instead, Ryan stood slowly, said nothing, picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. Tae-hyun watched him carefully. "Boss!" Ryan didn't turn around. "Where is she?" Tae-hyun hesitated for just a fraction of a second, barely anything. But Ryan felt it. The hospital. Ryan walked out his office without another word. Alone. No men. No escort. He got into his car and drove across Seoul by himself and felt something cracking open inside his chest the entire way there. He arrived at the hospital and did not go upstairs immediately. He stood in the lobby for a moment, this man who walked into every room in Seoul like he owned the air inside it, and felt something he had not felt since he was a boy: uncertainty. He found the billing department on the ground floor, sat across from the clerk. "I need to settle the account for a patient." He gave Lydia's name. The clerk looked at the balance on the screen and looked back at him. Ryan placed the card on the counter. All of it. The clerk processed it without a word. Ryan signed where required and stood. He rode the elevator upstairs alone. The maternity ward was at the end of a long corridor. He walked it slowly, stopped outside the door, put one hand flat against the surface, and stood there breathing. He had walked into rooms full of the most dangerous men in Seoul without blinking once. He had never been afraid of a door in his life. But this door was different. Behind this door was everything he had chosen to walk away from. He pressed it open slowly and stepped inside. The room went completely silent when he walked in. Diana, who was sitting in the chair beside the bed, rose slowly to her feet. Her eyes found him immediately and did not move from his face, not with panic, with the cold, steady look of a mother who had watched her only daughter suffer for 9 months and had not forgotten a single day of it. Lydia was sitting up in the bed. She looked up when the door opened. When she saw him, she didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She just looked at him, and the exhaustion in her eyes was so deep and so total that it hit him harder than any anger could have. He opened his mouth. She raised one hand. "You paid the bill." It wasn't a question. He said nothing. She held his gaze. "Thank you." A pause that lasted a long time. "Now please leave." He stepped forward. "Lydia." "I said leave, Ryan." Her voice was completely level. He looked past her at the 2 bassinets beside the bed. Ashton's face serious, still, eyes closed. Aria's tiny fist curled against her cheek. He stood there looking at them for a long moment. Then he looked back at Lydia. She had already turned her face away. He nodded once, and he left. In the hallway outside, he stopped walking and leaned his back against the wall. The corridor was quiet. A nurse passed without looking at him. He stood there for a long time. This man whose name made rooms go silent, completely still and completely alone. He had seen his children for exactly 40 seconds. He had looked at his son's face and his daughter's fist and felt something break open inside him that he didn't have a name for. He had built an empire across the city. He had made decisions that moved money and territory and men without hesitation or regret. And standing in that hospital corridor alone, he understood for the first time with complete and terrible clarity exactly what he had done. He had chosen his business. He had chosen it coldly and completely and without looking back. And now he was standing in a hallway being asked to leave by a woman who had every right to ask him. He pushed himself off the wall eventually, walked to the elevator, rode it down alone, got into his car in the parking lot, and sat there without starting the engine for a very long time. Seoul moved around him. He didn't move at all. Lydia was discharged 4 days later. She went directly to Diana's penthouse with Ashton and Aria bundled carefully against the autumn air. Within 2 days, Ryan had traced them there. He arrived on a Saturday morning with 3 of his men behind him carrying gifts, a designer pram, 2 matching cribs still in their boxes, bags of finest baby clothing money could reach for, items carefully selected by someone who had clearly spent real time thinking about what 2 newborns would need. Diana opened the building door, looked at Ryan, looked at the men behind him and the mountain of gifts between them. Then she looked back at Ryan for one long, quiet moment, and went back inside without a word. Minutes later, Lydia appeared in the doorway. She looked at everything assembled on the doorstep. Then she looked at him. "Take them back." He stepped forward. "Lydia, please." She didn't raise her voice, didn't cry, just held his gaze with those steady, exhausted eyes. "Take them back, Ryan." He stood there. "I just want to take them back." He turned and quietly dismissed his men. They retreated with everything they had brought. He stood alone on the doorstep. She looked at him one final time. "You said your business comes first. Go run your business." The door closed. Inside, Lydia stood with her back against the closed door and didn't move. Ashton and Arya were sleeping in the next room. She could hear the small sounds of them through the wall. Diana was in the kitchen. The penthouse was warm and quiet and completely ordinary, and she slid down the back of that door until she was sitting on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest. She pressed both hands over her mouth. She had told herself in that hospital bed that she was done crying over him. She had told herself she had used up every tear she had. But this was different. This wasn't grief for a marriage or grief for a man. This was something rawer than that. She had carried his children through 9 months of complete silence. She had delivered them alone on a table while his name came out of her mouth without permission. She had held both of them against her chest in a delivery room with no one beside her but her mother, and he had shown up with furniture. Diana came and found her on that floor. She didn't say a word. She simply sat down beside her daughter and put her arm around her shoulders. Neither of them spoke. They sat there together on that floor in the quiet until the silence stopped being so sharp. He went back to his penthouse, not the one they had shared. He had left that behind when he disappeared. A different one, bigger, quieter, more expensive, emptier. He sat in the living room without turning the lights on and listened to Seoul outside the window for a long time. Tae-hyun called. He looked at the name on the screen and set the phone face down on the cushion beside him without answering. He opened a drawer in the side table. Inside, a photograph. He had kept it without entirely understanding why. It was from their first year together. Lydia, laughing at something off camera, head tilted back, completely unguarded. He had taken on his phone one Sunday morning when she wasn't paying attention. He stared at it for a long time in the dark of that empty room. Then he set it face down beside the phone. And he sat with the heaviest thing a man can sit with, the complete and total knowledge that every single consequence surrounding him had been built entirely by his own hands and his own choices and nobody else's. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in that dark living room until the city outside turned gray with morning, and then he sat there some more. The rules arrived through a mutual contact 3 weeks after the hospital visit. Written clearly, delivered formally. He may send gifts for the children on their birthdays. He may not visit. He may not call. He may not arrive unannounced under any circumstances. He accepted every condition without negotiation. The first birthday came. Ashton and Arya turned 1 year old on a bright Thursday morning inside Diana's penthouse. Ryan sent gifts, carefully chosen, age-appropriate, delivered by a courier, so there would be no confrontation at the door. The gifts were received. He was not. He stood outside Diana's building that morning in a plain dark coat with his hands in his pockets. Not his penthouse, the pavement. He looked up at the windows of the building for a long time. He didn't knock. He didn't call. He just stood there for close to an hour while his children celebrated their first birthday 1 floor above him without knowing he existed. Then he left. The second birthday arrived. He sent gift again. He stood outside again. Same coat, same pavement, same windows, same hour of standing in silence, same walk back to his car alone. Tae-hyun heard about both visits through his contacts and smiled privately to himself both times. 2 full years of distance gave Ryan something his empire never had. Silence deep enough to think inside. And in that silence, he began to notice things he had been too close to see before. Small things at first. A decision Tae-hyun had made after Lydia left that benefited only Tae-hyun. A territory adjustment that Ryan had approved in the fog of those first months that he now couldn't fully account for. A name that appeared twice in financial reviews that shouldn't have appeared once. He started pulling threads quietly, alone, without telling anyone. The way he had built his empire, methodically, patiently, without showing his hand. And the more threads he pulled, the colder the picture became. Meanwhile, across the city in Diana's penthouse, Ashton and Arya were 2 years old and completely alive with it. Ashton was serious and watchful. He spoke in careful, deliberate sentences and observed everything around him before reacting. Arya was the opposite, loud, fearless, running through every room like the walls were suggestions. Lydia watched them both one evening chasing each other around the living room and laughed the first time in what felt like years. A whole life was being built. full and real and warm and completely without him. And Ryan was only beginning to understand the full weight of what that meant. The truth came apart in one night. He was alone in his office, late, the city dark outside the windows, going through financial records he had quietly pulled over the previous weeks. He spread everything across his desk: documents, dates, phone records, transaction logs, access reports from the night Lydia disappeared from their life. He sat there and assembled the picture piece by piece, and with every piece that clicked into place, something inside him went colder and quieter and more still. The federal investigator's name on Taehyun's fabricated documents. Ryan found the man's actual case files through a contact. Lydia's name did not appear anywhere in them. Not once. Not a mention. Not a reference. Not a connection of any kind. The phone records Taehyun had placed in that folder. Ryan traced the numbers carefully. They were real numbers. They did not belong to Lydia. Someone else had made those calls. Someone who had access to enough information to build a convincing lie and deliver it to a man already being slowly softened by doubt. Ryan sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. Lydia had never betrayed him. She had never spoken to anyone. She had simply been a wife who loved him. And Taehyun, his most trusted man, had taken that and destroyed it deliberately and completely. He called Taehyun into his office the following morning. Taehyun arrived composed as always, dark suit, measured steps, the careful, unhurried confidence of a man who believed he was completely safe. He sat across from Ryan and waited. Ryan looked at him for a long, quiet moment without speaking. Then he said, "You took my family from me." Taehyun's expression didn't change immediately. "Boss, every document, every phone record, every conversation you whispered in my ear over months." Ryan's voice was completely calm, the kind of calm that had always preceded the most dangerous decisions of his life. "You built it all from nothing, and you handed it to me, and you watched me destroy my own life with it." Taehyun's jaw tightened. "I was protecting the empire. You were protecting yourself." Ryan stood slowly. "You're done." Taehyun stared at him. "Boss, leave." Taehyun left. Ryan stood alone in his office after the door closed. The twins were turning 3 in 4 days. For days. And he had missed every single moment of their lives up until now. Then from outside his office, he heard one of his remaining men say, casually, "Those kids are better off without him anyway. They have a real life now." Something broke completely open inside him. He looked at the calendar. For days, he did not go as the man Seoul feared. He did not go in a tailored suit with men flanking him in cars waiting outside. He took a cab, a plain, ordinary cab, across the city on a Tuesday morning that was cold and overcast and completely unremarkable. He wore dark trousers and a simple jacket. No watch, no entourage, nothing that belonged to the life he had built. He paid the driver and stood on the pavement outside Diana's building and looked up at it for a moment. He knew she might not open the door. He knew she had every right to keep it closed forever. He had prepared nothing to say. He had no speech, no prepared apology, no gifts waiting in a car around the corner. He had only himself, broken and reduced and stripped of everything that had ever made rooms go quiet when he entered them. He walked to the front entrance, stood before the door, and then he did something Ryan Seojin had never done for any person or any reason in his entire adult life. He lowered himself to his knees on the cold concrete outside that door. His hands rested on his thighs. His head dropped slightly, and he stayed there, just a man, on his knees, with nothing left but the truth of how completely he had broken everything that ever mattered. Diana saw him first. She was passing the window when something outside caught her eye. She stopped, looked, stood completely still for a long moment, watching him on that concrete. Then she turned from the window, without expression, and went to find Lydia. She didn't say anything, just touched her daughter's arm gently and tilted her head toward the window. Lydia looked up from where she was sitting with Arya in her lap. She crossed the window. She looked down. Her hand went slowly to her mouth. He was still there, not performing, not looking up to check if anyone was watching, just down, completely still, his knees on cold concrete, his face wet, his shoulders carrying something so heavy it had bent even him. In the next room, Ashton and Arya had been singing something to each other over their birthday cake. 3 candles burning, completely unaware of what was happening outside their door. Their father was on his knees on the pavement below on the very day they were turning 3. Lydia stood at that window and watched him for a long time without moving. Diana came and stood beside her. Neither of them spoke. The hour mark came and went. Then the second hour began, and still he did not get up. After 2 full hours, Diana walked to the front door alone. She opened it and stepped outside and looked down at him. He looked up at her, his eyes red, his knees bleeding where the cold concrete had worn through, his face carrying every single day of the nearly 3 years that had passed between them. Diana looked at him for a long, quiet moment. She did not rush what she had to say. She cried every night for a year. Her voice was steady and quiet and landed like something permanent. Not because she missed you, because she was afraid your children would grow up and become you. He closed his eyes slowly. A long breath left him. Diana looked at him a moment longer. Then she stepped to the side and left the doorway open behind her and walked back inside without another word. Lydia appeared in the open doorway. She stood there looking at him on his knees, bleeding, broken, reduced to nothing outside a door he had no right to knock on. He looked up at her. "I know I don't deserve this door to be open," he said quietly. "I know I don't deserve those children. I know I don't deserve you. But I am not leaving this concrete until you know that I am sorry with everything I have left." A long silence passed between them. Then Lydia said quietly, "Get up, Ryan. The children want to meet their father." He met Ashton first. The boy stood in the middle of the living room and looked at him with those dark, serious eyes. Ryan's own eyes in a 3-year-old face, and said nothing, just looked. Ryan crouched down slowly to his level and stayed there quietly. He didn't rush, didn't reach out, just waited. Ashton glanced at Lydia once, then back at the stranger. Then he walked slowly to the bookshelf in the corner, picked up a small toy car and walked back and held it out toward Ryan without a word. A 3-year-old's version of an offering. Ryan took it carefully with both hands. "Thank you," he said quietly. Ashton stared at him, then sat down on the floor right beside him like he had made a private decision. Ryan sat down too, on the floor, in his plain jacket, beside his son. Arya appeared from behind Diana's leg moments later, looked at this stranger sitting on her living room floor, and walked directly over and climbed into his lap without invitation or hesitation the way only small children can claim a space that was never offered to them. He held her carefully. She grabbed his finger. He looked up at Lydia standing in the doorway watching all of this with her arms folded across her chest and her eyes full of something she was working very hard to hold together. Before the evening ended, Ryan found Diana alone in the kitchen. She was washing dishes quietly with her back to the door. He stood in the doorway until she turned and looked at him. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he lowered himself to his knees on her kitchen floor. Diana went still. "I am sorry," he said quietly, "for every night your daughter cried alone. I am sorry for every morning you carried what I should have been carrying. I am sorry for every birthday I missed. I am sorry for every day those children grew without a father because of decisions I made." He looked up at her. "I am sorry for all of it, every single piece of it." Diana looked down at him for a long time. Her expression was unreadable. Then something shifted very slightly in her face. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet, but recognition. The recognition of a man who had finally arrived at the truth of himself without being forced there. She reached out and placed one hand briefly on top of his head the way a mother would. Then she turned back to her dishes. "Get up," she said quietly, "and don't make me regret opening that door." He stood. "You won't," he said. She didn't answer, but her shoulders relaxed just slightly. And that was enough. 1 year after Ryan walked away from his empire, Kwon Tae-hyun was arrested. The authorities had been building their case quietly for longer than anyone inside the organization had realized. When it finally came, it came completely and without warning. Tae-hyun was taken from his home on a Wednesday morning. 3 other senior members went the same day. The charges were extensive: racketeering, fraud, conspiracy, money laundering across multiple jurisdictions. The sentences handed down were long. Taehyun received the longest of all. Had Ryan still been inside that world, his name would have been in those same charges. His photograph beside Taehyun's. His sentence read aloud in that same courtroom. Ryan read the news on his phone at the kitchen table that morning. He read it once, then set his phone face down. Ashton climbed onto his lap without asking, serious and warm and completely trusting. Arya reached across the table and stole a piece of his toast without apology. He let her take it. He looked up. Lydia was watching him from across the table with her coffee cup held in both hands. She said nothing. She reached over slowly and placed her hand over his on the table. He looked at her. She smiled, small and quiet and warm. She had pulled him out of that world, and that was the greatest thing anyone had ever done for him. The new house settled into life slowly and beautifully. Not dramatically, just quietly and steadily the way real things do. Ryan learned that Ashton liked his eggs a specific way and would push the plate away without drama if they were wrong. He learned that Arya sang to herself while she played, small made-up songs with no real words, and that if he listened too obviously she would stop. He learned that Lydia still made coffee the same way she always had, and that she stood at the kitchen window every morning for exactly 5 minutes before the day started, and that this was not a moment to interrupt. He learned all of it by simply being present, by showing up every morning without exception, and staying until every light in the house was off. One evening after dinner, Ashton fell asleep on the couch with his head on Ryan's leg. Arya was on the floor, drawing something with complete concentration. Lydia sat across from him with her feet tucked under her, reading quietly. The room was warm. The city outside was far away. Ryan looked around at all of it, this ordinary, unremarkable, beautiful evening, and felt something settle inside him so completely and so permanently that he understood he would never go back. Not for anything. Not for anyone. This was the only empire that had ever been worth building.